A men's shelter that he took me to a couple of years ago that was just clearly not adequate and not appropriate in a city like this, and he's made other arrangements. The city, under his leadership and with my full support and that of the council, has purchased a hotel not too far from here that was itself not a terribly viable business, and we're going to actually put some of these men into much better accommodations, and I think that's what we're trying to do over and over again, but it's a daunting task. This building, you might recall, was back in the news. It was in the news back in 2015 when bricks on the outside of the building fell off. They literally just fell off the building and slammed into the ground. And fortunately, nobody was hurt. And you can see that at the present time, not only are we in the process of fixing that by replacing the outside cladding of the building, but they're also in the process of fixing the balconies and essentially replacing a lot of the railings. So there's work being done on this building, and I guess that could be described as good news, and that is part of what gets paid for out of the massive amounts of money I'll discuss with you in a moment that has been put into these buildings by the Toronto Community Housing Corporation and almost exclusively by the City of Toronto. But the bad news is, in this and many other buildings, in the case of this building in particular, 24 units in this building have been closed. And we saw one of them this morning. And while a place never looks good when there's no furniture in it and when it's been allowed to sort of sit for a period of time, I think you could see that the floor had been completely ruined and big parts of the tiles had been taken up because of leaks that came from the ceiling. And you could see other aspects of the building, including in the bathroom and the kitchen, that were just not in a state of repair that would leave them such they could be lived in. And so it's an example, one example of 24 in this building. Now, I should tell you that on our budget, where we are slowly but surely exhausting the money that the city has put up, and we don't have as yet the other money, some of which is going to come from the federal government, as I'm going to discuss. Those units are on the list to be fixed in the next 12 months or so, but they're not fixed yet, and they sit empty today in a city where we're short of housing units and where we have a substantial waiting list. What I want to share with you today is some facts. I just want to really deal with facts that I think outline the issue that's before us, that Councillor Crawford referred to, and that is the need for all three governments, municipal, provincial, and federal, to come meaningfully to the table to get this job done. So to start with, let's just look at the size of the community, and it is a big community here, and I'm going to go through these with you. 110,000 people call Toronto Community Housing home. So I pointed out before, this is a community that is spread across the city, but is the same size virtually as Thornhill in Toronto Community Housing. The scale of the issue is absolutely unique to Toronto, and by way of comparison, I can tell you that Hamilton, for example, has 13,000 residents in social housing. Ottawa has 32,000 residents in what they call Ottawa Community Housing, 15,000 units. So our comparator is 58,000 units and 110,000 people, compared to, say, Ottawa, which is obviously a very big city that has 32,000 residents in 15,000 units. And all of those 58,000 units, or virtually all of them, were downloaded by the province to the city years ago, and a lot of that housing wasn't in good shape when the city got it. Many buildings were poorly built to begin with, and we're discovering that now, and we did, I'm sure, before, as we sort of looked at some of the problems. And the state of repair was allowed to get worse, to the point where the total backlog reached $2.6 billion at its peak. Now, since then, the City of Toronto has put almost $1 billion towards that backlog, so we're left with a $1.7 billion backlog in repairs that need to be done by 2022. And you can see that illustrated over here. So while we used the $2.6 billion number because it was the basis upon which we suggested that a fair and reasonable way of dividing that up would be a third between the three governments, given their different sources of revenue, the backlog today remains at $1.7 billion, and that's reflective of the fact that the city has put up almost $1 billion of its own money, with a tiny contribution from the province and from the federal government so far. And you can see that as we go forward, with the city having virtually exhausted its sources of money, which I'll make reference to in a moment, it heightens the risk in the absence of other money coming forward of units actually having to be closed. And you can see what those numbers are. We have used, as a means of raising our share of that money, every reasonable tool that I think people would expect us to use. We have used City of Toronto dollars derived largely, as you know, from property taxes. We have used the refinancing of mortgages, and we have used the sale of assets. In this case, as you know, we've sold, for example, some of the scattered housing with authority from City Council, and that money has gone to Toronto Community Housing Repairs. So the question that now is clearly on the table, and that I've been trying to illustrate in a reasonable and consistent way, is: isn't it fair and sensible that the other governments, which extract billions more from Toronto in terms of income taxation, corporate taxation, sales taxes, and so on, billions more than come back to this city? And that's a fact that's existed for a long time. Isn't it fair and sensible that those governments should become part of the solution for this problem? TCHC staff have been very clear to us, and you've seen that there are units that are actually closed. And the picture that's on that particular board over there is the bricks falling down, and the picture that you'll find on the TCHC website shows one of the floors with all the tiles having come loose because of all the water leaking that just makes those units uninhabitable. We have 600 units across the 58,000 unit portfolio that may have to be closed by the end of this year. We have 400 units, another 400 that may have to be closed by the end of next year, and we have a 7,500 units that could have to be closed up by 2022. So that is 7,500 housing units which could be housing and should be housing 7,500 families and individuals. Now, today you saw me meeting, and you had a chance to meet some of the people who call Toronto Community Housing home. And I think it's useful to point out again what the facts are with respect to who it is that lives in these 58,000 units. And you'll see that when we have the problem we have, the residents are overwhelmingly people who are either children, 22,000 children, 21,000 seniors, and 23% of the residents dealing with mental health issues. So I think I have been fair when and I could give you many more statistics, but I think I've been fair when I have described the people who live in Toronto Community Housing as among the most vulnerable people that we have in Toronto. So not only do they face a problem with their housing in terms of units that are close to being uninhabitable in some cases, and repeated problems such as we saw in the first unit that we visited upstairs, but we also have people that are already struggling with many other issues that confront them and that make it difficult enough for them to live their lives. I want to be very clear, and I've tried to do this every single time I speak about this, and this will make it today no exception. I welcome some of the things that the province of Ontario did in its recent budget that actually will be of some assistance with some of these issues. So, for example, they took the initiative to invest in some more supportive housing. This has been a big problem in Toronto going all the way back to the first time I ran for mayor. I remember it being an issue we debated over and over again in 2003. The fact that we correctly closed the large mental health institutions in the province and didn't replace them with more supportive housing on a kind of a more local basis. So they did that. They put up some land that's to be made available for affordable housing. They brought in some initiatives with respect to pharmacare. I acknowledge all of those things. I acknowledge those things are going to provide some benefits to the people of the City of Toronto, as well as some of the initiatives they have announced with respect to more assistance for affordable housing. But I say respectfully to them at the same time, that doesn't mean that the Government of Ontario can continue to stand back from the challenge of repairing the homes that are home to some of our most vulnerable citizens in Toronto Community Housing. I just don't believe that the list of things that are done in the budget, however commendable they may be, make up for the fact that nothing by way of any new funds were provided for the housing units that we've visited today. My job as mayor is to stand up for Toronto and to stand up for its needs and to stand up for its people, its residents, especially those who find it harder to speak for themselves. And I believe very strongly that all three levels of government have a moral imperative. They have a moral imperative to help act on social housing and starting with repairing the social housing we have. I've also mentioned many times, and I will again today, there's a business imperative too that is just common sense. These are public assets owned by the people, owned by the governments in effect, and to not repair them and let them get to the state where, as you saw in Etobicoke, some of them actually have to be torn down, to me is just not sensible. It's not sensible. And I believe that the relative ability of those other governments to raise money in Toronto and outside of it to make fair and reasonable repairs makes it also fair and reasonable for me to ask them to participate in that. So I want to show you this next slide, which clearly shows you who has paid for what slide so far. And by the way, this slide over here shows you the relative revenue-raising abilities of the different governments. Toronto raises about $12 billion each year. About $3 billion comes from property taxes, and a lot of the rest of it comes from other governments and so on. Ontario raises $106 billion of its own revenue each year, and the Government of Canada raises $296 billion. So to me, and a lot of that money, I would argue, comes from Toronto. I know there have been studies many times produced in the past showing that far more is raised out of this city, the economic engine of Canada, than comes back to the city, even with the investments that these governments make in this city. But what has happened when it comes to social housing repairs is that those who have the greatest ability to raise money have not yet stepped up, although I will say there's very heartening news coming from the federal government. And so what you have is you have, so far, as I mentioned, you have Toronto having put in almost $1 billion. The province has put in a very small sum, which was virtually almost limited to energy retrofits. They put in nothing else by way of social housing repair money, and even the social housing repair money that is referred to in the budget and that they refer to repeatedly in their extensive correspondence they send me in the most recent days and press releases is not new money. May I share with you again a fact? And that is that there is no new money in the Ontario budget this year for social housing repair whatsoever. What they mention in the budget is money that was announced some time ago, some of which will flow in 2017, but it's not new money. And the quantum of it is quite modest, indeed, relative to the scale of the problem. I will tell you there has been more good news coming from the federal government, and I want to be fair to them that while the amount they put in to date is relatively modest, and I want to just add this onto the chart so that it's clear I'm acknowledging what they've done, that Budget 2017, unveiled recently by Mr. Morneau, does contain significant new money for housing, which they've assured me as recently as this morning and yesterday will have the flexibility attached to it that we can apply it to repairs of Toronto community housing. So I'm just going to add the words, to be fair to them, plus Budget 2017. And so that money, they're in the midst of negotiating with the province now to sort out how that's going to flow and when. But again, I've been assured that there will be money flowing at the latest in 2018. So it means just as we exhaust the municipal resources that we've applied to this, there will be some federal money to help us to keep on with these repairs. Now, some people have said that Toronto should simply raise property taxes to fix this problem. I want to make clear that these are the revenue amounts that come in to the three governments. In our case, it's our own generated funds, property taxes, TTC. The other governments do have the other sources of revenue, such as sales and income and corporate taxes. If property taxes were determined to be the answer to fund these billions in additional repairs, the $1.7 billion that remains after we've already put in $1 billion in city-derived funds, I would say two things to that. First of all, property taxes were never meant to fund multi-billion-dollar capital projects. They were not meant for that. They were meant to provide for the provision of basic services to people: police, fire, roads, parks, and so on. But if people were to say, fine, that's just how you're going to have to do it, I would point out that is going to mean double-digit property tax increases just to finance the Toronto community housing repairs. That's the magnitude of what would have to be done here. And that was never the intention as to what property taxes were meant for. This kind of double-digit property tax increase, for example, would force many seniors from their homes and that would just cause another housing problem. So I've laid out some facts today when it comes to housing repairs that I believe need to be funded by all levels of government. I think it is fair and reasonable that they should step up to assist us. The federal government has stepped up and has announced funding, and while we can't be sure of exactly what is coming to the City of Toronto as yet, it is going to be a significant sum of money. It is going to flow relatively soon, and we know for a fact that it's going to have the flexibility associated with it that we can apply it, should we choose to do so, and as we will, in significant sum, to the repair of these housing units. The province of Ontario, in its 2017 budget, did not allocate any new money to the social housing repairs, and what they have put forward to date has been very modest and has confined itself to energy retrofits, which means things like new boilers and things like that, which are part of the repairs we have to do, but not enough to help us address some of these problems you've seen today. Once funds are allocated,